specifics, right? It's clear that the Pakistani state has a huge impact on what's happening there. The question is, are they intentionally using this Shia-Sunni thing to keep control?
Right, because that's what the source is suggesting, right?
Yeah. Is that what's really happening, or is it just a case of them trying to keep things stable and it blowing up in their faces?
Yeah, unintended consequences, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And this is where that call to action in the source comes in.
Okay.
They're saying people need to speak up against the Pakistani military and intelligence agencies. They want people to hold them accountable for all the violence that's happening.
And it's not just about saying, hey, you did something wrong.
No, not at all.
It's about recognizing that people are suffering.
Exactly.
That Pashtun people are caught in the middle of this.
Yeah.
This source paints such a sad picture.
I know, it's tough to read.
Communities being torn apart, families forced from their homes.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump right in. Today we're diving deep into Kurram,
Okay.
a region in the Pashtun territories that's often in the headlines for conflict. Now, the common narrative is that it's all about this big clash between Shia and Sunni Muslims.
Yeah.
But we've got a whole stack of sources suggesting it's way more complicated than that.
Absolutely.
So we're going to try and unpack that today.
Sounds good.
Get beyond those simple explanations and see what's really going on.
Right.
You ready to dig in?
For sure. Let's do it.
One of the things that really jumped out at me from these sources was the impact this conflict is having on the daily lives of ordinary Pashtuns.
Yeah.
I mean, just imagine living in a place where you're constantly on edge, worried that your neighbor might turn against you because of your sect.
It's a classic case of divide and conquer, isn't it?
It really does seem that way. Like, one of the sources actually quotes someone saying, the Shia-Sunni issue is not as large as it's made out to be. It's not worth killing your brothers over. But then the same source also talks about extremists on both sides putting ordinary people at risk.
Yeah.
So how do we make sense of those two seemingly conflicting ideas?
Well, I think the key thing to remember here is that the Pashtun people in Kurram, they share so much in common. A common culture, a common language.
Right.
There's this strong sense of unity that goes beyond religious differences.
So are you suggesting that this conflict is something that's being imposed on them from the outside? Like, it's not organically coming from within the community itself?
That's exactly what I'm getting at. And to really understand how this situation came to be, I think we need to step back and take a look at the history.
You're talking about the whole historical backstory of the Shia-Sunni divide.
Exactly. You know, it all goes back to the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD.
Right.
And that big question of who should succeed him as leader.
I mean, that's like Islam 101, right? But just to refresh everyone's memory, the Sunni view is that leadership should be decided by consensus.
Yeah, by consensus from among the Prophet's companions.
And they ended up supporting Abu Bakr, who became the first caliph.
The Shia, on the other hand.
Right.
They believe that leadership should have stayed within the Prophet's family.
Correct. Specifically with Ali, his cousin, and son-in-law.
Right. And I'm assuming this wasn't just some polite theological debate, you know?
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
Sadly, over the centuries, this initial disagreement got all tangled up with power struggles, political rivalries, and far too often, violence.
It's like that old saying, power corrupts, you know?
For sure.
And the sources we've got, they point to a whole bunch of empires and rulers who really exploited these sectarian differences.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Safavids. It's like a whole historical playbook on divide and conquer.
It's a recurring theme throughout history.
It's sad but true.
One example that comes to mind is the Safavid Empire in Persia.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the 16th century, they actually forced Sunni populations to convert to Shia Islam,
creating these deep resentments and divisions that still echo today.
So they weren't just taking advantage of existing divisions. They were actively making things worse.
Exactly. And it's crucial to keep in mind that despite these differences, both Shia and Sunni Muslims share the same core beliefs and practices. The Quran, prayer, fasting, the Hajj pilgrimage. These are fundamental to both branches of Islam.
But even though they have that common ground, those power plays, those manipulations, they really drove a wedge between them.
They did. And sadly, that wedge continues to be exploited even today, but now on a global scale.
All right, so let's fast forward a bit to the modern era.
Okay.
The sources point to Iran and Saudi Arabia as major players in this whole situation.
Right, and it's almost too perfect. Right?
It's like, come on.
Iran, predominantly Shia. Saudi Arabia, predominantly Sunni. Talk about a recipe for tension.
You're telling me So they're almost destined to be rivals, right?
It certainly adds fuel to the fire. Their rivalry has fueled proxy wars.
Oh, for sure.
And conflicts across the Middle East, from Iraq to Syria to Yemen.
Yeah.
And these conflicts, driven by sectarianism,
right,
they inevitably have ripple effects, intensifying the divide even in places like Kurram.
It's like they're playing this dangerous game of chess, using religious differences as pawns in their own geopolitical strategy.
That's a very apt analogy, but it's not just external powers at play here. The source also points a finger at Pakistan itself,
right,
accusing the state of actively fueling the conflict in Kurram.
And they don't hold back. The source alleges that the Pakistani military and intelligence agencies are directly responsible for killings, violence, and the destruction of Pashtun villages in the region.
It's a serious accusation.
Yeah.
Is the Pakistani state truly exploiting the Shia-Sunni divide to maintain control, as the source claims?
That's a huge question, right?
Huge, and why would they do that? What are the potential motives?
Yeah, what's the end game here? And it gets even more intense.
Okay.
The source claims that Pakistan actually created these divisions,
fostering extremism and tribal conflicts to benefit themselves.
Now, that's a very specific and controversial claim.
For sure.
One that needs to be carefully examined. We need to look at the evidence, consider different perspectives, and make sure we're not jumping to conclusions.
Right. We need to be objective about this.
Absolutely. But one thing is clear.
Okay.
The Pakistani state plays a significant role in the region.
Right. That much we know.
The question is, are their actions intentionally making the conflict worse, or are they just dealing with unintended consequences?
Yeah, I mean, they do have a responsibility to keep things stable, to maintain order.
Right.
But if they're actually fanning the flames,
yeah,
that's a whole other story.
It is. And this is where the source's call to action comes in. They're urging people to speak out against the Pakistani military and intelligence agencies,
right,
demanding they be held accountable for their alleged role in the violence.
And it's not just about holding those in power responsible. It's also about acknowledging the immense suffering of the Pashtun people who are caught in the crossfire.
You're absolutely right.
This source really paints this heart-wrenching picture of communities torn apart.
Yeah.
Families displaced.
It's a tragedy.
Lives lost. It's a human tragedy that often gets overshadowed by all the geopolitical maneuvering.
It's easy to forget about the human cost when we talk about these big, complex issues.
One thing that struck me was the source's use of this phrase, fake controversial Islam.
Oh, interesting.
They argue that certain clerics in Pakistan are promoting this distorted version of the faith.
I see.
And using it to justify violence and division.
That's a fascinating point. It suggests that religion itself isn't the root cause here.
Yeah.
But rather that it's being manipulated and weaponized for political gain.
So it's like they're twisting the teachings to fit their agenda.
Exactly.
Using religion as a shield to deflect any criticism.
It creates a very dangerous situation, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
Anyone who dares to question or challenge the narrative, they risk being labeled as blasphemous or apostate.
It's chilling to think about.
Yeah.
People are basically being silenced.
Yeah.
Forced to go along with this manufactured version of reality out of fear.
It's a tactic that's all too common in conflicts like this. Fear and intimidation become tools of control, making it almost impossible to have a real dialogue, to build understanding and work towards reconciliation.
It's a bleak picture, but the source does offer some glimmers of hope. They talk about the resilience of the Pashtun people, their deep desire for peace.
That's important.
And their willingness to stand up for what they believe in.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It'd be so easy to get lost in the negativity, right?
Totally.
The violence, the seemingly impossible situation. But we have to remember that there are people working for peace.
Right.
People who refuse to let the manipulators win.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
Exactly. And it highlights how important it is to amplify the voices of those who are fighting for change.
Because their voices deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. We need to give them a platform, support their efforts, and help shift the narrative away from division and towards unity.
And on that note of shifting the narrative,
the
source raises this interesting point about external powers using the Shia-Sunni divide to weaken Muslim unity as a whole.
Right.
They argue that historically, colonial powers and other outside actors have seen this division as an opportunity to exploit and control the region.
That's a really important historical perspective to consider. It reminds us that conflicts are rarely isolated.
Right.
They're often shaped by these bigger geopolitical forces, by hidden agendas,
right.
power dynamics that extend far beyond the immediate region.
So it's like they're pouring gasoline on a fire that's already burning.
Exactly.
Using the conflict to advance their own interests.
Which is why it's so important to be critical of simplistic explanations, right?
For sure.
We have to dig deeper, understand the historical context, the geopolitical maneuvering, and the motivations of everyone involved.
It's about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And recognizing how conflicts are often manipulated and exploited for political gain.
And maybe most importantly,
it's
about remembering that at the heart of this conflict are real people.
Right. Real people with real lives.
Human beings whose lives are being torn apart by forces beyond their control.
The source really highlights the plight of Pashtun mothers in particular.
Oh, yeah.
Who've lost children, husbands, homes to the violence.
It's heartbreaking.
Their stories are both devastating and incredibly inspiring at the same time.
Their resilience in the face of such loss is truly remarkable.
It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit.
Absolutely.
And a powerful reminder that even in the midst of conflict, hope and compassion can still exist.
It's easy to get caught up in the abstract discussions of geopolitics and strategy.
Yeah, we can't forget about the human cost.
Exactly.
Those mothers, those families, their pain is real.
And their stories need to be heard.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've delved into this incredibly complex situation in Kurram.
We have.
We've seen how the Shia-Sunni divide, though rooted in history, is being actively manipulated for political gain.
Right. And we've explored the roles of Pakistan and external powers in fueling this conflict.
And we've seen the devastating impact it's having on the Pashtun people.
Absolutely.
But even with all the darkness and complexity, there's still that glimmer of hope.
There is. That hope comes from the resilience of the Pashtun people and their yearning for peace. It also comes from the possibility of change, which the source dives into next.
Okay, so given this whole mess, what are some potential solutions? Because honestly, it feels like we're dealing with a tangled knot of geopolitical spaghetti.
Right. It's complicated, but the source does offer some paths forward.
Okay.
They emphasize education and awareness as a first step. If people understand the historical context and how these religious differences have been manipulated, they'll be less likely to buy into the divisive rhetoric.
Empowering people to think critically. That makes sense. But what about those who are already deeply entrenched in their beliefs?
Right.
How do you bridge that gap?
The source talks about interfaith dialogue and cooperation. Imagine if we could build relationships across religious lines, where people see each other as human beings with shared values, not just members of opposing groups.
It sounds ideal, but is that really realistic in a place like Kurram, where tensions are so high?
It's a long road, no question, but not impossible. It requires strong leadership from both the Shia and Sunni communities. Religious leaders and scholars need to step up, promote tolerance and understanding, and speak out against the violence and extremism.
So strong leadership from within is key.
Yes, but what about the external forces we talked about?
Right, the ones who are actively fanning the flames.
Exactly.
How do we hold them accountable?
The source calls for greater accountability on all fronts. Not just for those within Pakistan who are exploiting the situation, but also for external actors like Iran and Saudi Arabia who are meddling and making things worse.
So basically, we need to shine a light on those shadowy networks of power and influence.
Exactly. We need to hold those responsible to account for their actions, whether it's through international pressure, sanctions, or other means.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what's the one key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with from this deep dive?
The conflict in Kurram is not inevitable. It's not just a product of some ancient religious dispute. It's manufactured, fueled by political and geopolitical agendas. And that means we can work to dismantle it.
So there's hope.
There is. By understanding the root causes, challenging the divisive narratives, and working together, we can create a different future for Kurram.
Beautifully said. And this isn't just about Kurram.
No, not at all.
We see these same dynamics playing out in conflicts all over the world.
It's a call for all of us to be critical thinkers, to look beyond the surface and never give up hope for a more peaceful world.
That's a powerful note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, listener.
Thanks for having me.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a world where peace wins.
I couldn't agree more. But regardless of like the specifics, right? It's clear that the Pakistani state has a huge impact on what's happening there. The question is, are they intentionally using this Shia-Sunni thing to keep control?
Right, because that's what the source is suggesting, right?
Yeah. Is that what's really happening, or is it just a case of them trying to keep things stable and it blowing up in their faces?
Yeah, unintended consequences, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And this is where that call to action in the source comes in.
Okay.
They're saying people need to speak up against the Pakistani military and intelligence agencies. They want people to hold them accountable for all the violence that's happening.
And it's not just about saying, hey, you did something wrong.
No, not at all.
It's about recognizing that people are suffering.
Exactly.
That Pashtun people are caught in the middle of this.
Yeah.
This source paints such a sad picture.
I know, it's tough to read.
Communities being torn apart, families forced from their homes, lives lost. It's a human tragedy that gets lost in all the talk about geopolitics and strategy.
It's like the human side of the story gets forgotten.
There's this phrase in the source that really stuck with me, fake controversial Islam.
What do they mean by that?
They're talking about how some religious leaders in Pakistan specifically, they're pushing this distorted version of Islam.
Wow.
Like twisting it to fit their own agenda.
So it's not really about faith at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're using religion as a weapon to justify violence, to create division, and to protect themselves from criticism.
That's scary, using faith like that.
It is, and it creates this atmosphere where anyone who questions things is immediately shut down.
Branded a heretic or something.
Yeah, accused of blasphemy or apostasy.
Yeah.
It's like a way to control people through fear.
Yeah, silence dissent and make everyone fall in line.
It's a classic tactic, unfortunately.
Sadly, yeah. Fear and intimidation are powerful tools of control.
It makes having a real conversation, finding common ground, working towards peace.
Yeah.
It makes all that almost impossible.
You just hit a wall.
But even with all that said, the source does hint at some hope.
Okay, that's good.
They talk about the resilience of the Pashtun people.
Their strength?
Yeah, their strength, but also their desire for peace, their willingness to stand up for what they believe in.
I mean, it would be easy to just give up, right?
Right, with everything they're facing.
They're not. They're still fighting for a better future.
It's inspiring, honestly, that they haven't lost hope.
Absolutely. And it shows us that even in the darkest situations, change is possible.
And it also shows us how important it is to support those who are working for peace.
Lift them up.
Yeah, amplify their voices, help them make a difference.
We need to shift the focus from the conflict itself to the people trying to solve it.
Exactly.
Because they're the ones who deserve our attention.
And speaking of shifting the focus.
Okay.
This source brings up a really interesting point about how this Shia-Sunni divide is being used by some to weaken Muslim unity on a larger scale.
Oh, interesting.
Like they're suggesting that historically, colonial powers and other outside actors have seen this division as an opportunity
to exploit it.
Yeah, to control the region for their own benefit.
That's a whole other layer to this, isn't it?
Right. It's not just about what's happening in Kurram.
No.
It's connected to this bigger global power struggle.
And it shows how important it is to think critically, to not just accept simple explanations. We need to dig deeper, understand the historical context, the geopolitical maneuvering, all the motivations at play.
Because if we don't,
yeah,
we risk being manipulated ourselves.
Exactly. We could end up playing right into their hands.
And at the end of the day,
yeah,
we have to remember that real people are suffering because of this conflict.
Absolutely.
The source talks about Pashtun mothers who've lost their children, husbands, their homes.
It's just devastating.
Their stories are both heartbreaking and incredibly inspiring at the same time.
That kind of strength is incredible.
It's a testament to the power of the human spirit.
It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, hope and compassion can still exist.
And those stories, those experiences, they need to be heard.
They do. They should fuel our own desire to work for peace.
Yeah, to create a world where this kind of suffering isn't tolerated anymore.
Absolutely. So we've really gone deep into this situation in Kurram.
We have.
Explored how the Shia-Sunni divide is being used for political gain.
And seen the devastating impact it's having on the Pashtun people.
But even with all the darkness and complexity, there's still that glimmer of hope, right?
There is. That hope comes from the resilience of the Pashtun people and their yearning for peace.
Absolutely.
It also comes from the possibility of change, which the source dives into next. Okay. So, given this whole mess, What are some potential solutions? Because honestly, it feels like we're dealing with a tangled knot of geopolitical spaghetti.
Right. It's complicated for sure, but the source does offer some paths forward.
Okay, good.
They emphasize education and awareness as a first step. If people understand the historical context and how these religious differences have been manipulated, they'll be less likely to buy into the divisive rhetoric.
Empowering people to think critically, to question the narratives they're being fed, that makes sense. But what about those who are already deeply entrenched in their beliefs? How do you bridge that gap?
The source talks about interfaith dialogue and cooperation. Like, imagine if we could build relationships across religious lines, where people see each other as human beings with shared values, not just members of opposing groups.
It sounds ideal, but is that really realistic in a place like Kurram? I mean, tensions are so high.
It's a long road, no question, but not impossible. It requires strong leadership from both the Shia and Sunni communities. Religious leaders and scholars need to step up, promote tolerance and understanding, and speak out against the violence and extremism.
So strong leadership from within is key.
It is, but what about those external forces we talked about? The ones who are actively fanning the flames.
Right, the ones who are meddling and making things worse.
Exactly.
How do we hold them accountable?
The source calls for greater accountability on all fronts, not just for those within Pakistan who are exploiting the situation, but also for external actors like Iran and Saudi Arabia who are meddling and making things worse.
So basically shining a light on those shadowy networks of power and influence.
Exactly. We need to hold those responsible to account for their actions, whether it's through international pressure, sanctions, or other means.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what's the one key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with from this deep dive?
The conflict in Kurram is not inevitable. It's not just a product of some ancient religious dispute. It's manufactured, fueled by political and geopolitical agendas. And that means we can work to dismantle it.
So there's hope.
There is. By understanding the root causes, challenging the divisive narratives, and working together, we can create a different future for Kurram.
Beautifully said. And this isn't just about Kurram.
No, not at all. It's a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers, to look beyond the surface, to question the narratives we're given, and to never give up hope for a more peaceful world.
That's a powerful note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Kurram, listener. And thank you to our expert for helping us unpack this complex situation.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Remember to keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a world where peace wins.